The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar. I apologize for the delays. Been having an issue with GoToWebinar, wasn't able to open it, but I think we are good now. So thank you for attending, and I apologize again. Today we're going to be talking about uh, DevSuite and how we can do development within it. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and I believe it's already shared. And then we're going to go ahead and launch DevSuite. Okay, so I'm going to log in as a sample user. I'm going to flip over to our development module. Let's just give it a second here. All right, and to do so, basically you flip over to development issues and tasks. It's represented by this orange icon. You can potentially have multiple of these. If you were using an older version, each one of these in the previous versions would represent a product or a project, but in the new Dev Suite, all of your projects or product development will be sitting within one place. So if you're interested in doing a merge, just let us know and we can assist you with that. So I'm going to go ahead and open that. I already have it opened. It's over here on the right-hand side, the second tab here. And really, I'm going to begin by just describing how we're going to be able to set up the structure here, the folder structure. So if you were in the previous sessions, I showed you how we can set up the folders within the requirements management module, but inside the development module is going to be essentially the same thing. So at the root level, you're going to want to set up your products or projects. So each one of these root folders right here would represent that. And then underneath, I'm going to have a couple of different examples for you. I think for Content Sharing Manager, it's actually using a Scrum methodology. So down below, what I did is set up milestones, and they're represented by this little circle icon. So we have our milestones or releases. So you can really name that however you like. In my example, I just named them different versions. And then underneath that, I enabled the sprints. Okay, so this is just an agile methodology here. And I believe for my other products, for maybe a different development team, I basically don't use any sprints. I'm just doing, something a little bit more waterfall. I create my different releases, and underneath it, I have, what features and defects, et cetera, that I'm going to implement within that release. Okay, so now the functionality you're going to get, even if you don't practice Agile, you may want to go ahead and enable these sprints, only because they're going to give you a little bit more features like the task board and things like that, which are extremely useful, even if you're not practicing Agile. So I would highly recommend that we enable these, regardless, because you don't necessarily have to run them by sprints. You can maybe change that to a build number or whatnot. You can always change the date, the duration of these sprints. So I would highly recommend that. I've also enabled one more feature that I believe many people don't know about, and that is the Kanban methodology. And so within Kanban, and I apologize for this example, this should actually not sit, with the different versions and whatnot. But essentially, what we're going to do is just have a everlasting cycle, and within a cycle, we have all of our features. And I'll show you a little bit of Kanban in this as well. So DevSuite, DevTrack here, the development module will support multiple methodologies. And this is another way of kind of mixing different methodologies together. So every feature that you see within here, you don't necessarily have to turn them all at once. Whichever features you think can help you, you can enable. So it doesn't really have to be strictly following any kind of methodology. These features can be enabled accordingly. So looking at Content Sharing Manager, before I even do that, I'm going to show you guys how to create that. So it's very simple. You right click, we're going to just do a new dev space, and that's going to create one of these root folders. Okay, so one of these guys below here. And in it, when I go and edit or when I create new, the most important thing I want to look at is the type. Okay, so the type right here. And that's going to allow us to enable a couple of different features. Okay, so right here, when I do the type, we can specify whether it's going to be agile development or traditional development. With agile development, you're going to get those multiple release folders. They're not really sub-releases, but those version folders that I have, and then as well as the release backlog. And if you want to do Kanban, you want to enable this feature to support WIP limits. And I'm going to show you that all of that in a little bit. Okay, so I enable all these features. Traditional, I think you're just going to get the sub-release folders or the release folders rather, and no sprints and whatnot. So I'm going to leave that as is for now. And then I'm going to go ahead and close that. And then underneath, we can go ahead and just do a new child. And that will allow us to create a new version. And by the way, these guys can all be renamed within admin. So if you want to call your versions, milestones or releases or what have you, you can always rename that. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and just do maybe version 4 right here. There's a little bit of resource management here. You can define the teams that are going to be working within this version and whatnot. So I'm going to go ahead and hit next. I'm going to submit, and then now we have our new version. Okay. Then underneath, since this is an agile type, we're going to go ahead and do another one. So we're going to do new child, and then now underneath we can do, sprint 1 for this version. So I'm going to go ahead and hit next. And here you can kind of see by default my sprints are 2 weeks. You can define the duration within the admin. You can also set the start time and the finish dates, manually. So I'm able to change this however I like, but the default will be 2 weeks. So I'm gonna go ahead and submit that now. All right, so that's how you would set up the structure here. So again, they represent the different products. And again, in previous versions, we didn't have this concept. So each one of these products or projects may potentially be represented at this level. So now, in the newer versions, we can go ahead and just set up one of these, one development module, and then just have it, do, multiple products. And the benefits to that would be, let's say you're an administrator, and you want to make a change to the workflow perhaps, or you want to add a field to one of your issues or tasks or whatnot, you would only need to do it within one place. You wouldn't have to go in and do those changes, multiple times for each of these development modules. So I would highly recommend that your products are all within, one development module. Okay, but if you wanted to, have a different workflow and things like that, you could potentially create another one of these. Alrighty, so now down below, this guy, I have the product backlog here. That's something that could be enabled as well. So what you could really do is you could, set up iterations and not use the product backlog. So there's some flexibility there. Again, it's whatever features, you feel like you're going to be able to take advantage of. But as a whole, I enabled, everything for agile development. So inside the product backlog, these root folders that I've created are going to be, extremely similar, identical to the ones above, right? So again, I could just right click, I can say new folder right here, and I'll call this new project. And then that's where I want all my issues, all my features and whatnot, for this particular project to be in. So I'm going to go ahead and submit that. And now I have a new project. Okay, so every one of these backlogs are going to contain features that are specific for that project or product and whatnot. Now, the thing with this development module is that all of these guys that you see here, requirements, development, testing, some of you guys may not have the entire suite. So you might just have, development, the test library without the requirements and whatnot. But my system is fully integrated. So then my requirements, what's going to happen is they're going to be carried over to my backlog. Okay, so I'm going to actually open that for now. In my requirements, this is where I'm going to do all my features and whatnot. Just give it a second, it's loading. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to assign those features into this backlog, and then I'm going to plan my iterations. Okay, so these guys that you see over on the right-hand side, these are essentially requirements or specifications rather that I brought over from our requirements module. But let's say if you didn't have the requirements module, you can actually create standalone stories within the development module. So again, it's a It's a feature that we can enable. If you have it integrated with requirements, you're essentially going to be carrying it over from there. So what I'm going to do inside the requirements module is I'm going to go ahead and right click and I'm going to go ahead and say assign to backlog. And essentially what this is going to do is it's going to open up a dialog. And I think I have some workflow restrictions. So I'm going to go ahead and assign to the backlog here, and then I'm going to be able to specify where I want to put those features in. Okay. So instead of assigning, from requirements directly into one of these releases, one of these, sprints, I'm actually going to, put it in our placeholder in our backlog first. And the reason for that is um, I'm going to be prioritizing these features, right? Before we simply just assign to a version or a sprint. So to prioritize, essentially what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click and I'm going to prioritize the items. And so you'll see that I'm actually collapsing everything because there's some tasks underneath. You don't have to create these tasks right off the bat. Essentially it should be looking something like this where I have all my features and then I kind of just drag and drop. So things that are going to be, higher in priority, I'm going to go ahead and move to the top. Okay, so that this guy right here, this particular spec or story is going to be, the highest on my list, and then I'm going to go ahead and submit that. And if it was working, we would have that, prioritized list. So essentially, the backlog is going to serve for that purpose. It's a placeholder for everything. Now, I've only talked, about features so far. But your defects can also be sitting in here. Okay, so it's a backlog for everything. Um, let's say you were using our testing module. Any defects or any failed tests that you find and you want to submit a defect, they would actually be brought into the backlog here. So in other words, you're going to be prioritizing not only features, but also defects and issues at the same time. So similarly, if there were any of those, we can prioritize within this backlog. Okay, if you were using the requirements module, this is highly optional because your requirements module is going to be serving kind of like your backlog, right? So you can also do prioritization within here, and then you can simply assign to development into a sprint without going through the backlog, right? Because this is essentially your backlog as well if you were using the requirements module. Okay, now one last thing I want to talk about this too is let me see if I have my standalone stories enabled. Okay, I do. So what I did was I right-clicked. If you didn't have the requirements module, what I did was I right-clicked, I do new story and task, and you'll see an option right here as a standalone story. Okay, so if you weren't using the requirements module, but you want that story layer, then you can go ahead and just use the standalone story. It has to be enabled in the admin, and I'm gonna say a new story, and then of course we can give the story some description and whatnot. But in this case, I'm gonna just go ahead and submit that. And there we have it. So it has a completely different icon. Um, your system wouldn't look like this right now. It wouldn't have, requirements here and then stories here. It would be one or the other, right? Depending on which modules you utilize within DevSuite. So you can have, a standalone story without using the requirements. If you were using the requirements module, then a story is going to have a workflow. It's going to have a spec, right? It's going to go through the entire requirements management process before it gets to development. Okay, now if you didn't care about all that, you just simply want a story to describe the feature. Let's say it's they're small features and whatnot, then you can always do standalones. Okay, underneath every story, every spec, we can go ahead and create these tasks for them. So what this means for this example right here, it just means that for this particular story or spec, in order to complete it, these are the following development tasks that we have to complete in order to complete that. Okay, so I'm going to talk about that in a little bit, but I just wanted to explain to you, what exactly is underneath all of these. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and collapse those. And now let's talk a little bit about um, how we can prioritize this, right? Or we have it prioritized, but which ones can I assign to a sprint, okay? So let's say today you are practicing sprints and you are using story points and whatnot. What we're gonna do is we're gonna go ahead and assign story points to each one of these guys here. Okay, so you can see smaller text spec 2, it's got 5 points. This guy's got 20, and that really just measures kind of the complexity of the story compared to another, right? So it's not necessarily in terms of hours or anything like that, because different people would do things at different speeds, right? So it's kind of like a normalized point system. So I have 20 here, and this is arbitrary. You can put any number you want, this guy right here basically just means that it's a little bit more complex than the guy above it. But the prioritization um, is still such that this guy is more important than this one. Okay, so if you were practicing sprints and whatnot, you normally can tell, or as the process gets more mature, you're able to tell how many points can be sitting within any given sprint. So let's just say I'm mature enough to determine that, hey, every sprint we can do about 50 points, right? What I'm going to do then is, since this is a prioritized list, I'm going to go ahead and assign about 50 points worth, right? So I'm going to keep assigning or keep picking items I want to do, and then fill that bucket up, right? Fill that sprint up. So I want to give about 50 points worth. Then what I'm going to do is simply just drag and drop right into it, or I can just right click and I could say assign, assign to a development. Okay, so it's pretty simple and straightforward there. So I'm going to go ahead and take some of these. Um, there's going to be these dashes, -1, -2, etc. And that really just means that, how many times have we implemented this feature? Okay, so an example of that would be, let's say, if I had 26-1 implemented in Sprint 3, but then by the end of Sprint 3, I found out that I got to do some additional tasks. And what I would do is drag 26-1 back into the backlog, reassign it to Sprint 4, and it'll become 26-2. It simply just means, how many times have I done this particular story? Okay, so there's a little indicator for that. All right, so the next thing I want to do now is I'm just going to take one and I'm going to go ahead and assign that to, let's say, sprint 4. Okay, and when I do that, I'm going to get the following tasks that need to be completed by default. Okay, so here I got maybe mobile development, maybe Windows development. Everything's represented by a different task. QA is probably incorrectly represented. What I really mean by QA would be something like unit testing and things like that. For QA, for testing this feature, it's really going to be done in the test library in the test run. So it's not really that traditional black box testing or anything like that. It's really just checking the code, making sure it works as a different task. Okay. Now, a lot of you guys may not be using these tasks. You actually may be creating these in a workflow. So I'm going to show you how my workflow looks like real fast. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and go into the admin. All right. And then within the admin, I'm going to go ahead and open the workflow. Actually, I already have it open there. So under the workflow design, this is my workflow here, right? So I have, and therefore tasks. So basically it's very straightforward. Any new task comes in, sits right there in that state, then it's sitting in progress, then I, do some testing. So again, this guy right here can actually just be represented as a task instead of a different workflow state. I could simply delete that, right, and represent that as a task. And so that's how I'm able to keep my workflow really, simple. You guys may have, something like this where, this is, all these different states that are representing these tasks. So for example, I just showed you the unit testing one that was sitting in my workflow, but I could add documentation there too. So, if, most of us would probably have another state, right? It's ready for documentation, something like that, right? So and that would be part of my workflow. So essentially what I'm saying to you is you can dramatically simplify your workflow by just using these tasks. And the good thing about this too is you don't necessarily have to change ownership at all. So when you're moving things through the workflow, the owner is always going to be the same person. And that's going to enable us to see the effort for each person within any given sprint. Okay, so there's really not any kind of ownership change. Every one of these tasks are going to be represented or completed by a different owner, right? So that's the benefit of having these tasks, and it keeps the workflow extremely simple. Now, what about defects? So inside DevTrack, or the development module, you can also set up multiple workflows. Okay, I don't know if I have that enabled, and I think I did. So you would do multiple workflows. So you can have a workflow for tasks, and then maybe another workflow for defects and whatnot. So you would just simply enable this multiple workflow feature, and then set these workflows against the different types of work items that you have, whether it's tasks or issues. So we're going to have this, how to do this recorded in a separate YouTube video. I'll share that with you. I'm not going to cover that in the session, but I just wanted to let you guys know that you could potentially set up multiple workflows for different development items. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and submit that. And then now over on the right-hand side, once I do that backlog, I have it prioritized. Then when I sign into the sprint, that item is going to get moved out of the backlog and it's going to sit right below that particular sprint. Now, similarly, if I wasn't using sprints, I could have done the same thing, at the release level. So if I go to this guy, if we look underneath it, there's no sprints. I'm essentially just dragging right into that release that I want these, features to be implemented in. Okay, so the sprints are just a smaller breakdown of these releases. You can have as many sprints as you need to. You're going to also probably see different colored icons as well. So my system is currently not set up correctly. Red icons, just, they're things in the past, but if I had edited the date correctly, let's say, the sprint start date was next week, then this actually becomes blue, right? So it's just not set up, accordingly just yet, but these would have different colors to indicate, what's the current sprint, what hasn't started, etc. Okay, so now, once you do prioritize those features, you can also, and you assign them to the sprints, you can also create the tasks later on, right? So in the backlog, I wouldn't recommend you creating the task there, only because, for sprint planning, it's going to take way too long. So really, you shouldn't have any of these guys sitting inside the backlog just yet. But once you do determine which features you want by just dragging into the sprint, you can always right-click on these guys and you can say new group tasks. Okay, so we can always do that at a later time. So now after all of these features that I want, these 5 features, now I can go ahead and create the task for those. Okay, so I can always do the same thing. So you can kind of see, and the system is very flexible. I had that option when I dragged and dropped into the sprint. I can do it afterwards, but for me, my recommendation would always be to, just go ahead and do your sprint planning and then create your tasks for them afterwards. Okay, so now I have my task sitting here. Again, that's new group tasks here. And there's another option I kind of want to show you guys right here. There's, create a new task. So these guys are all configured by default to be there. We can uncheck them if we didn't want those tasks. Let's say we're only doing web development. We're not doing mobile and Windows in this particular sprint. We can uncheck that if we needed to. We can also create any ad hocs, any ad hoc tasks we want in here. Okay, so there you have it. So if I click on any of these, I'm able to change the ownership as well by just coming in here and just changing the owner for each one of these. Okay, all right. So now the next thing I want to look at is, okay, so these are the things that I have assigned out to this particular sprint. So going back to what I was saying earlier about even if you were doing traditional development, you're not using sprints, you may want to enable that only because you get this board view right here. Okay, so this board view basically there's a couple of different ways to look at this data. All right, so the board view gives you a visual representation of where things are at. Up on the top right here, I have, my different status columns. I have new, in progress, test verify, close. Again, this is an extra state because I'm representing, these guys with tasks, right? So this is an extra. So, but essentially what these are your workflow states, okay? Now, going back into it, um, over here on each row right here, they would actually be your stories, okay? Now, there's, again, there's a couple of different ways to see that data, but I can click on the setting icon right here. And what I did as a best practice is show story as a separate column. So that gives me the stories, broken down by the task here. And then also I'm doing fixed columns. I could do, some of these other options, but then my board will start looking a little bit strange. Okay, but anyway, it's pretty flexible. So there's settings up here that allows you to see this data in different ways. Okay, so here now, what I'm looking at is for this particular sprint, I have, whoops, I didn't mean to click on that. I have these stories over here on this left-hand side, and I have the following tasks. So it looks like all my tasks are sitting in new, right? And then so as I'm working through these sprints, essentially what I'm going to be doing is just moving things over. Okay, then I might simply submit that, and I'm just moving these cards around and whatnot. So um, you shouldn't get all those extra dialogue, screens that I just had. I had a bunch of extra features turned on, so yours should just simply be, just dragging and dropping into the right states. Okay. Similarly, if you weren't using this board, you're probably just going into the task itself, or the issue or whatnot, and then you're just modifying it here. Okay, so you're changing the states by clicking on those transition lines, and those transition lines are these guys in the workflow. Okay, so yeah, so the board view gives you a way to just drag and drop cards around and whatnot. Now, let's talk a little bit about this percentage here. So as you're working through these tasks, you could then start using maybe time. So here I have 2 hours spent, 2 hours remaining. So you can always do an initial estimate on how long you think this person is going to take to work on this task. Originally I had this as a 4-hour task, but as I'm working through it, I'm putting in this time, right? So I'm reducing time remaining to 2 hours because I already spent 2 hours on it. And then that gives me my 50% that I see there. Okay, so, um, you know, as a best practice, you might want to, go ahead and use those time features only because they give you this percentage. All of these guys actually do a roll up too. So as I'm completing these, right here, this percentage is going to change. If you're using the requirements module, your product owners are able to see that completion as well, that percentage within the requirements module. Okay, so at a high level view, they're able to see, what's happening with these without coming into the development side of things. Okay, by putting in that time entry. So not only do we get that visual cue, that visual board here, there's a couple of other things that we get to see. So we can see how this sprint is doing by clicking on the summary here. Up on the summary, we can see who's got what, um, the workload here, the tasks, the number of tasks, points, things like that. They're all represented for this particular sprint. Similarly, if you were practicing Agile, you can get burnout reports, right? So the burnout report is also in here. That could be based on either the time entries that we put in or a point system. Okay, so it depends. Some people use points, some people use time for these particular tasks, but we have either option. All right. Now the last thing, or actually a couple more things I want to talk about this board is, again, we could see different things. So I can actually do additional swim lanes. So if I do owner here, then I'm able to actually see all my team members within this particular sprint. And then now I can easily see, what they're working on. So this particular person's got, one task sitting here. This guy's got, however many tasks. So for your daily stand-up meetings, right, if you were practicing that, your 10-minute, meetings in the morning or not, you can kind of just go down this list, right? So let's go with this person first, move on to the next, kind of discuss these issues or any obstacles that you may be having. All right, so I find that pretty useful. Lastly, you can group by any other field that'll give you your swim lane. So if you want to do urgency, you can do that as well. Um, let's see. So one thing about this guy too is the progress status here. So is what I'm using now, but maybe I want to use this kind of like a calendar. So I'm able to flip this board into plan finish dates. Okay, so we can have our owners again as the swim lane, but this time I'm using the plan finish dates, and then now this board becomes not just the progress, but kind of like your calendar. All right, so now, I haven't indicated, when I expect to finish these, but, I can go ahead now and drag this into any particular date that I think I'm going to finish in. Okay, so I can say, yeah, well, I'm going to do this task Wednesday, maybe do this guy Thursday, etc. So we can just drag those into the right dates. Okay, so that's another feature that you're going to get with this particular with the storyboards that we have within the system. All right, one last thing about this too is I don't know if you guys been watching this, but you're also able to get that workload percentage. So let's look at Matt Peterson. He's got 40%. So earlier I showed you, adding in time entries into these tasks. By doing so, this workload will come out. Okay. This is a 2-week sprint. So if I, had this person working 100% by clicking on the schedule, and I said he's going to work 100%, 8 hours a day, right? Things like that. Then we get his capacity. And then, as we're putting in time remaining for these tasks right here, then his workload is going to go up according to, what his schedule is. Okay, so some people use that, some don't. It's just a feature that we have there. Um, so it's kind of useful in certain scenarios and whatnot. Okay, so going back to our traditional board here, there's one last thing I'd like to show you guys, and that's Kanban. Okay, so some of you guys may be wondering, hey, how come your column right here is red and whatnot? So let's go look at Kanban real quick. So Kanban is basically an everlasting cycle, right? So we're gonna go ahead and look at that. So I just created it's a sprint type of folder, but there's not going to be multiple sprints. It's not time box or anything. Basically, what Kanban is just, as soon as you finish one thing, go ahead and put in another. Okay, so now in this board right here, we see, a bunch of tasks, right? And then, we have this yellow column. And then we have like a 1 out of 1 here, right? So what this means right here is what I did was I set up my whip limits. Okay, so I'm saying at most how many things could be sitting within the status, and I do that by just clicking on that number there, and I say, what's my minimal number of tasks that I can have? What's my maximum number that I can have? Okay, now since there's no task sitting there, then I can say, I'm sorry. Then this board basically will become yellow. Essentially, it's saying it's ready, um, to have something be done in there. So I can go ahead and drag that, and then basically what will happen then is it becomes clear. Okay, it becomes white. So that just means that hey, okay, everything looks good. We are doing what we're supposed to on a daily basis and whatnot. So now look what happens if I drag another one in here, then that's when it becomes red because what it's saying is, hey, you set the whip limit to 1, but you got 2 tasks here, right? Um, so you got a little bit too many items for that particular status. Okay, so again, it's pretty useful. If I do by owners too, you can actually set whip limits per person. Okay, so I can say, for myself here, for anyone actually, I'm gonna set the whip limit to be 1 because at any given time, a person can only do one task, right? So I can do that too. So visually, it'll be really fast for me to see, in a Kanban perspective, if somebody needs to do an item, right? So it's very agile. It's not time box, but um, it's kind of that assembly line sort of. So, right here it looks like everything's good. But if it was yellow or red, then I can adjust accordingly. So that's what Kanban is. And I'm gonna go ahead and edit that. Again, it's under this type right here, and we're able to go ahead and support that. Okay, support the whip limits. All right, so having said that, what else do I want to share with you guys? The last piece that I want to share with you is this little planning icon too. Okay, so as you're working through these tasks and whatnot, um, we have this little planning icon. This used to be for planning, but nowadays I kind of use it as a report. So if I go to planning here, it shows me everything in a Gantt chart perspective. Okay, because assuming that I have start and end dates for everything that I'm doing, then this Gantt chart is going to look pretty nice. Okay, so I'm going to fit it. Actually, I'm going to minimize this a little bit and kind of see, well, I'll drag this out. But essentially, that gives me a roll up. One of the most important things is it gives me a roll up at, a project basis, right? So not only can I see under version 4, version 3, all of these different, sprints and whatnot, but, as I'm doing these tasks, I'm filling in time or points, those percentages get rolled up to, these sprints, and then, it keeps going up, right? It rolls up to the versions, the milestones, and then finally the project itself. So this is a really good view for me to see how I'm doing on these projects. Let me see if I can expand this because over here, I should be able to see these tasks. Oops. But right now, I think, I don't have that set up correctly. Anyway, so you're able to actually expand this and see the tasks as well. And those would be also represented um, within, within this Gantt here. So not only am I seeing, a Gantt for the different folders here, but also the tasks as well. Um, if you were doing traditional, then this actually does become a planning view, right? Say I don't care about Agile, I don't care about any of these sprints and whatnot. As long as I'm putting in a start and end date for these, you can kind of say, well, this guy is gonna be however long. Whoops, I didn't mean to do that. By the way, that line right there allows me to set predecessors and whatnot, so that's traditional planning. But I'm able to specify a start and end date, right? So what I'm saying is I can disable the rollup feature and actually manually put in the start date and the finish date, kind of like your Microsoft project and whatnot. So traditionally in the past that this guy was meant for that, but because we have agile pieces enabled, this actually becomes more of a report. Okay, so there you have it. So this is development in a nutshell. If you have any questions, again, you can go ahead and ask me right now in the webinar panel. So I'll take some questions right now if you have any. If we don't, then I think that would be the end of this session. Again, everything's going to be recorded. We'll send out links to you and whatnot. Okay, so it looks like we have no questions at the moment. Let's see. All right. Uh, yeah, it looks like we don't have any questions right now. Feel free to always reach out to me or our support team. And thank you for joining to this session.